underdeveloped countries as if they are like categories. This is processes. I don't know what's happening. I need there's some figures that I need to show, like on the computer. It's less sleep. That's probably the thing. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry for that. So yeah. So let's see. So as I said, in the 1970s, I think that was the golden age moment of these writings. There's many writings that we could point to, but probably the Samir Amin and Ergiri Emanuel, the stuff on unequal exchange, I think was one of the most important, most influential works. Since the 1990s, maybe before, but most important since 2000s, these theories in a way have been renewed under the name of unequal ecological exchange. So my concern with this, and this is where I get into a critical debate, is that authors that are discussing the issues of development and underdevelopment today are still harvesting the products of works that peaked in the 1970s. So they're still using the same framework. They just added the ecological dimension, and that has become probably the, let's say, one of the most prominent Marxist writing today. It's like unequal ecological exchange. So before it was the transfers of value from the periphery to the core, and the negative outcomes to the periphery. Now it's transfers of ecological resources and the transfer of negative environmental outcomes to the periphery. So they added the ecological dimension, and that in itself has become like the new writing. In my work, I argue that that's not necessarily that productive. Yeah. Why? Because capitalism changed in the 1970s. I will not go into the details of the crisis, but this I will just put it straightforward. The crisis of the 70s had many dimensions, but what is important for me is like how capital reacted to the crisis. So it doubled down on opening more spaces for accumulation and basically trying to undermine any restrictions to the mobility of capital. So one thing that I think is important is the trade liberalization and the liberalization of capital mobility that happened in the 70s. So under neoclassical theory, they call it capital account liberalization. The important thing about that is that when that happened, a lot of quote-unquote underdeveloped countries were able to get into product markets that were formerly supplied only by core countries. So when that moment happens, when the period where the core sells manufactures and the periphery sells raw materials, transitions to a moment where the periphery also is selling manufacture, that moment the change is not anymore complementary, now it's substitutive. It's like we are competing in the same dimension. And at that moment, according to many authors, and for example, Giovanni Arrighi, the outcomes of unequal exchange become a little bit ambiguous. Because at that moment, where you're able to sell what the core always sells, you're able to use low wages now as a strategic factor in competition. And you can outsell the core. So when that happens, unequal exchange is still operative. I'm not saying it's not operative, but it's not the determining factor of what is underdeveloped and what is developed. Because it's the moment where, and this is the language Giovanni Arrighi uses, and I like it, it's like when unequal exchange becomes the weapon of the weak, where they use low wages, low environmental regulations to outsell the core in many dimensions, not in all ways, not in every. So that moment means that there's a change in which the abstract space of capital becomes a little bit more open for the mobility across the world. And what happens is that when that change happens, my argument is that development and underdevelopment is a product of the uneven movements of capital itself rather than the inequality in exchanges. I know this is very abstract, and I apologize for that, but the paper will be better if you want to understand the argument. It's a technical debate. So my point is that we have to move from trying to understand inequality in terms of inequality in exchanges to inequality in development. What it means, uneven development as a distinct category than unequal exchange. Many authors in the 70s and even today use those categories interchangeably as if they mean the same thing. So even though they might say uneven development is like more fundamental, but almost like a synonym to unequal exchange, to underdevelopment. So they work with the assumption that many of those categories are the same. My argument is no, uneven development is something different. And since the 70s has become increasingly predominant, while unequal exchange is still operative but has become increasingly secondary in determining development and underdevelopment. What is my argument? That uneven development understood as the seesawing of capital from one region to another, now that it has free capital mobility and trade liberalization, and capital is able to move from spaces that are high wage, low profit, increasing environmental regulations, to places that are low wage, high profit, lower environmental regulations. And obviously when it goes there, it triggers itself the process of rising wages, so it moves to another place. Probably it might be even the place that was before high wage, that at this point has been disciplined back into low wages. Which is in a way, I think, what the Trump project wants to do in the US is like discipline back into low wages, into low environment, so capital can come. So in a way, in the short run, it might attract capital, and it might attract some development in the capitalist sense, but that always triggers, it's contradictory. So my argument is that that's the argument. And so for that, I developed this abstract model where I explained that in this context, meaning the 1970s and onwards, this doesn't work in there, okay. So any moment in time, you can see that song, I say song because I try to move from the abstract language of song and then to countries, regions, but for the theoretical moment, I will just use the neutral language of songs. So a song that is considered low profit is always continuously being victim of outflow of capital to the zone that is considered high profit, right? So that's the profit surface. So, and here I'm using Neil Smith's notion of the world after the liberalization. You can see it as an abstract profit surface where elevations are different depending on the concentrations of capital and profitability. So that zone itself that's high profit, at some point will trigger the labor capital struggle and becomes low profit. So you see that the zone B now is experiencing the outflow of capital. The time from time 2 to time 3 is experiencing the labor capital struggle, and it's losing profitability, it's losing standing. So itself, what that figure shows is that itself, it will be victim of this process of capital outflow. Because while at some point it was considered high profit, if you see from T2 to T3, that's the moment where it's experiencing the labor struggle, experiencing high wages, and it's becoming a low profit zone. So at some point that goes towards I'm speaking Spanish, but it passes a threshold which is too low profit. So it experiences outflow of capital. So what I add to that's Neil Smith's basic argument, I formalize a little bit, is that below the low profit, high profit thing is a question of cost. So a zone A here is high cost and low profit, if you see in the first. So it's experiencing outflow of capital to a place that is high profit and low cost. That place itself, zone B in the middle, will experience class struggle, unprofitable mechanization, underproduction of nature. So in time, it will become a low profit, high cost zone. So this is like, in abstract terms, trying to explain what is constantly happening in this new era. And in time, it will experience outflow of capital. So this is a new way of developing and underdeveloping regions. It's not as I'm selling you manufacture, you sell me raw materials, and you become poor, become rich. I think that was the moment where you have protections for some industry. But once the manufacturing industry can just move there, it's like, what is the point? Why I will send you raw materials and become poor if I can just try to build the factory here? And we both become poor, actually. It's not like we both. So my criticism of the comparative advantage is that supposedly that will create equality as towards the top, is equality towards downward leveling. So I don't know, how's my time going? Okay, so and here I'm being super simplistic, I'm trying to go over a lot of stuff. My discussion of the outcomes is that they're contradictory. So I talk about the intensified spatial competition, where it's not competition only between industry, but it's spaces itself. So you've seen this happening everywhere, from Puerto Rico to Spain to many places in Latin America, when they're trying to undermine labor regulations, environmental regulations, only to attract capital, to attract development. This is like sell as and I think this since we live it constantly, since that it was always like that, but it was not necessarily so. During the import substitution era, that was not the logic. The logic was to protect our industry, to control. Now it's not. It's like lower all the regulations that you can imagine, and capital would come. While in the import substitution era, was trying to build in capital ourselves here. It doesn't mean that it always worked, but it was a different logic. In this case, I think I don't know if you're familiar with the Larry Summers memo from 1991 that was leaked. I think that was the moment that this was codified, when he argued that actually people in Africa, they don't die of cancer because they die too young, so they are under-polluted, so we should, pollution is development, so we should move dairy industries there and they will benefit. They will not die at 30, they will die at 60 or 70 from cancer, so it's like, it was a very sarcastic argument that he wrote. It was leaked and then they denied that it was, but it's actually the logic was real. It's like countries that are underdeveloped are underpolluted. And so we need to bring pollution and development. This is today what governments are doing, and I say again, from Puerto Rico to Spain, not using that straightforward language, but they're following the same logic. So my point is that this creates different outcomes. One outcome is that it's like the negative, the spatial competition, the downward leveling of all nature. Always at the same time, I think it's creating like formation of people's consciousness of the real problems, of the real causes of. So I think the developments, especially in Ecuador, Bolivia, Mexico, Venezuela, maybe, is still a very dependent on oil. Where you see that where constitutions are trying to protect nature rights, to try to go against extractivism. So there's some developments that it seems that these guys understand what's happening, especially indigenous communities and left-wing movements. In the core, I think the outcome has been more perverse because the unfortunate appeal of right-wing populism. It's like let's try to protect our industries and rebuild this, but in reality, it's trying to do the opposite. It's trying to downward or how you say, undermine all regulations to discipline workers back into low wages and low environmental regulations. So Trump's plan to dismantle the EPA, and even though it's symbolic because the EPA is not like a radical institution, itself it says something about what is the plan. Finally, and this is like to me the long-term consequences that in any case there's a cognitive erosion of capitalist prospects, because even though you can leapfrog from one place to another for a time, in the long run, there's some problems that you cannot transfer anywhere. So like climate change, global warming, you can transfer some short-run consequences, but in the long run, it will feed back into the system, and it will basically affect capitalist profitability itself. I don't have time to go into the details in this, but I think the question of oil production is one important dimension where you can see how the capital is squeezed between a double structural squeeze in which it cannot live with high oil prices because it's always lead to profitability decline in oil-dependent industries, but low prices intensify the climate change issue. So you see that they're always trying to find this illusory equilibrium that will never be found. And I think here I will stop. Thank you for listening.
Roberto, Ortiz, and then do you have your?
No, I want to.
Oh, you don't need the PowerPoint?
No, it's all right.
Oh, okay.
Here.
So Alejandro de Cos from London School of Economics and Political Science, paper title Appropriating Water in Mexico City, the Reproduction of Capitalism, State, Nature, and City Through the Lurmen Water Supply System.
Hello all, thank you for being here. I'm really excited to be here. So I'll just start. This is a paper, this is the topic of the paper, is part of my PhD research project. I'm now finishing fieldwork, so these are some preliminary thoughts and conclusions. Not conclusions, just remarks. So I argue that capitalism requires not only the exploitation of labor to further its drive for accumulation. The appropriation of nature is also crucial, as it provides capitalism with cheap natures that keep the profit rates up and the system in a continuous expansion through the making of new frontiers. These cheap natures are not just out there, but they are the product of a continuous material and symbolic work which renders them knowable, valuable, and useful. And this same process, I argue, is also present in capitalist urbanization. Cities not only require labor and capital to become centers of accumulation and reproduction, they are also producers and products of processes of nature appropriation, which continuously supply them with cheap energy, food, and raw materials through the work of infrastructures. These natures are also historically produced, and are two parts of urban frontier dynamics that further the spheres of appropriation, and that in that way keep cities growing and working for accumulation. So in this presentation, I will analyze the process of appropriating water in Mexico City through the Lerma supply system. This system, the Lerma, was built in the middle of the 20th century, and is part of a longer history of water appropriation in Mexico City that can be traced to its origins up to the present day. This history is too broad to be discussed here, but it's characterized by a continuous expansion of the city's appropriation frontiers. So the Lerma system was the first interbasin transfer in Mexico City, and it transports drinking water from the nearby Lerma municipality in the state of Mexico towards Mexico City through a tunnel that crosses the mountain range, 14 kilometers. So this infrastructural system will be a way to explore the interpenetration of capital state technology and labor in the production of a cheap historical nature. And I will see here infrastructures as both a metabolizing process and a material producer of unequal and uneven relations in space and society, whose own reproduction requires the material transformations carried out by human labor. So I will analyze to fully grasp it in a twofold manner. First, I will frame the Lerma project as a producer of an unequal, of an external nature, which could then be appropriated through technology, science, and state power in order to guarantee the further urbanization of Mexico City. And then I will analyze how this external nature was also made cheap through the action of the state, and finally tapped through a labor process that materially produced water as a resource. So this Lerma project was officially drafted between 1941 and 1942, and it consisted of a set of 4 filtration galleries, a series of pumps to elevate the water when needed, the construction of a 14-kilometer aqueduct through the Las Cruces mountain range, and the connection of the new system to the one already existing in the Chapultepec forest area of Mexico City. From the tunnel down, it uses gravity as a motor force, and it was projected to supply Mexico City with 6,000 liters per second, which could then be increased to 14,000 when needed. The original project also included the construction of 4 hydroelectric plants, which were not built. I can tell you why later. But this would source the system and the city with electricity, cheap electricity, and at the time it was hailed as a definitive solution for the historical water supply shortages in Mexico City. It wasn't, but it was framed like that. So the project was led by government engineers, Eduardo Molina and Guillermo Terres, and it was not the first one to frame the Lerma waters as a potential natural resource to be tapped. In 1909, William Mackenzie had proposed to pump the water over the mountain range. And in 1936, engineers Villarello and Orozco also proposed to use the Lerma waters to supply Mexico City and for energy generation. And even before that, in the 19th century, the local government, the liberal local government of Mariano Riva Palacio, had proposed a project to desiccate the lagoons to use them to create a new small private property regime in the area. But the 1941 project was different for 2 reasons. First, it did not have the goal of producing this small landed class that was seen as a bearer of progress for 19th century liberals. Instead, it openly promoted the subordination of nature to the urbanization process of Mexico City, and it justified this by saying that the city was the seat of government, the head of industry, and the biggest commercial hub in the country. And in that way, the project of making and appropriating nature was part of the making of a modern capitalist urban space. And second, it proposed to use a set of new geological and hydraulic knowledges and new engineering techniques to make possible the difficult task of drilling through a mountain range and quenching the thirst of a growing city with faraway waters. And these technologies were presented as a cost-rational decision by those designing the project, and this is what's different from the previous projects to supply water. Now they had the technology, and the technology was cheap enough to actually work. However, these projects all share a structural objective, which is to subordinate what they posed as an external nature to further capital accumulation. And this externalization of nature was made through several means. One of them was to produce it as an unchanging object that was just waiting for mankind's conquest. Many scientific magazines at the time, like the Revista Mexicana de Ingeniería y Arquitectura o Ingeniería Hidráulica en México, praised the role of geography in mapping and framing space, the importance of accurate surveys, and the relevance of a detailed knowledge of nature transformed into resource. And this latter transformation, which is at the heart of making capitalist nature, was presented as the result of the application of new technologies. So the appropriation of nature as a resource was an engineering task, like in Lerma. So the key metabolizing process to transform this external nature into a resource would take place through the material infrastructures of the Lerma project, which I mentioned a bit before. And they were designed to capture waters from the springs or from underground aquifers, and they were plotted in plans that made space a measurable flat space. And their technical specifications were painstakingly described down to the last bolt to make it possible, to make it real, to make it a real object. But to function, they just not did this plan. They need also nature to be not only external, but also cheap. Now I'm going to turn to this, how water was made cheap. So in 1941, the head of the Mexico City government, Javier Rojo Gomez, requested a concession to explore and eventually exploit the Lerma waters on the basis of the project I just briefly described before. After a very lengthy discussion, the federal government granted his request, using its prerogative as the Lerma waters had been defined as national using the 1934 law. So this law, as Luis Aboites, a Mexican historian, said, was instrumental in placing waters under federal control, reducing significantly local powers over nature and resources. So the national character of the Lerma waters allowed the Mexico City government